My landlord illegally entered my apartment to intimidate me. He forgot his building has security cameras he bragged about installing. The first time I knew something was wrong, I came home to find my apartment door unlocked. Not just unlocked, slightly ajar, open maybe 2 inches, light from the hallway spilling into my dark living room. I'd left for work that morning at 7:30, pulled the door shut behind me, heard the lock click. I was certain of it because I'd developed a routine after years of city living. Keys in pocket, wallet check, door locked, handle tested twice. Muscle memory, automatic as breathing. But at 6:15 that evening, standing in the 3rd-floor hallway of my building with my work bag slung over one shoulder and takeout in my hand, the door was open. I stood there for a full minute, processing, running through scenarios. Had I somehow forgotten to lock it? Had maintenance needed to enter for some emergency? But there'd been no notice slipped under the door, no missed calls from the building manager, just my apartment, exposed to anyone who'd walked past all day. I pushed the door open slowly, called out hello into the silence, half expecting to find someone still inside. Nothing. The apartment looked untouched, TV still on the stand, laptop still on the coffee table, nothing obviously missing or disturbed. But something felt off in a way I couldn't articulate. The air was different, or maybe I was imagining it, paranoia filling the gaps my logic couldn't explain. I checked every room, looked in closets and under the bed like a kid afraid of monsters, found nothing. Then I noticed something subtle. My bathroom cabinet door was open about 1 inch. I always kept it closed. Always. It was one of those small habits you develop living alone, ways of maintaining order in your personal space. I opened it fully, scanned the contents. Everything seemed to be there, but the arrangement was wrong. The way I organized my toiletries was specific, almost compulsive. Someone had moved things, looked through them, put them back incorrectly. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I called my landlord, Vincent Caruso, left a voicemail explaining the situation, asking if maintenance had been in my unit. He called back an hour later, said no work orders had been issued for my apartment, suggested I'd probably just forgotten to lock up. His tone was dismissive, slightly amused, like I was wasting his time with nonsense. I insisted I'd locked the door, mentioned the cabinet, the sense that someone had been in my space. He sighed into the phone, that particular exasperated sound people make when they think you're being unreasonable. Quote 0. The casual cruelty of that dismissal, the suggestion that I was either drunk or crazy, made my jaw clench. I told him I didn't drink, that I knew what I knew. He said, "Well, I don't know what to tell you. No one has keys to your apartment except you and me, and I haven't been anywhere near your unit." Then he hung up without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same routine. Left for work, door locked, came home to find it ajar. This time I was certain I hadn't forgotten, and this time I noticed something I'd missed before. My desk drawers were slightly open, papers inside rearranged just enough to be noticeable if you knew how you'd left them. Someone had been going through my things, carefully enough not to leave obvious signs, but not carefully enough to perfectly replicate my organization. I took photos this time, documented everything, called Caruso immediately. He answered with an edge in his voice that suggested he was already annoyed before I spoke. When I explained about the door and the disturbed papers, he sighed heavily into the phone. The casual cruelty of that response, the suggestion that I was unstable rather than victimized, made my jaw clench. I told him I was calling the police. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, quote 3. Then he hung up. I did call the police, filed a report with an officer who took notes, but offered little hope. Quote 4. She explained. Quote 5. I said I'd received no notice, and there'd been no emergency. She said I could file a civil complaint if I believed my lease was being violated, but criminal investigation required more evidence than an unlocked door and rearranged papers. She was professional, but clearly skeptical, and I understood why. From outside my experience, this did sound like paranoia or forgetfulness, but I knew what I knew. Someone was entering my apartment without permission, and the most obvious suspect was the person with keys to every unit, Vincent Caruso. The question was why. I hadn't complained about anything, hadn't violated my lease, paid rent on time every month for the 3 years I'd lived there. What possible reason would he have to harass me? The answer came 3 days later in the form of a letter slipped under my door. It was from a law firm representing Caruso Properties LLC, informing me that my lease would not be renewed when it expired in 4 months. The letter cited repeated complaints and difficulty as reasons for non-renewal, which was absurd. I'd never complained about anything except the break-ins, if you could call them that. I'd been a model tenant, quiet, paid on time, caused no problems. But legally, landlords in my city didn't need cause to decline renewal of a lease. As long as they gave 90 days notice, they could simply choose not to renew, and there was nothing tenants could do about it. The timing was suspicious, though. Less than a week after I'd questioned him about the unlocked doors, I was being evicted. Not technically evicted. Non-renewal wasn't eviction, wouldn't show up on my rental history as a black mark. But the effect was the same. I'd have to find a new apartment, move, start over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what I'd done to trigger this. The building had been under new management for about a year. Caruso had purchased it from the previous owner, a decent guy named Phil who'd been fair and responsive. Caruso was different. He'd immediately raised rents for new tenants, started cutting services, replaced the building manager with his nephew, a surly kid named Anthony, who responded to maintenance requests with hostility. Several longtime tenants had moved out within the first 6 months under Caruso's ownership. I'd stayed because my rent was locked in at a rate significantly below market value, a lease I'd signed 3 years ago when the neighborhood was less desirable. Now the area was gentrifying rapidly, and my rent-controlled apartment was probably worth twice what I was paying. That's what this was about, I realized with sudden clarity. Caruso wanted me out so he could charge market rate to new tenants. But rent control laws protected me as long as I stayed in good standing. So he was creating reasons to justify non-renewal, manufacturing complaints to document a pattern of difficulty. I started keeping a journal that night, documenting every interaction with Caruso, every strange occurrence, every detail I could remember about the unlocked door. The act of writing it down made it real, gave me something concrete to hold on to when doubt crept in. I photographed my apartment from multiple angles, dated and saved the images, created a baseline record of how everything should look. If someone entered again, I'd have proof that things had been disturbed. I also started varying my routine, leaving for work at different times, coming home at unpredictable hours, hoping to catch whoever was doing this in the act. But nothing happened for 2 weeks. The door stayed locked, nothing was moved, and I started to think maybe Caruso had gotten spooked by my complaints, decided it wasn't worth the risk. I was wrong. He was just waiting, being patient, letting me lower my guard before striking again. The next morning, I called a tenant rights attorney whose name I'd found online. Her consultation fee was expensive, but necessary. I explained the situation. The mysterious break-ins, the dismissive landlord, the sudden non-renewal notice. Attorney Julia Keene listened carefully, took notes, then delivered the verdict I'd expected. I asked about security cameras, suggested installing my own. Keene said I was within my rights to install cameras inside my apartment, but warned that it might escalate the situation. I laughed bitterly at that. Quote 9. Keene's silence was answer enough. Document everything, she finally said. Save all communications, take photos, keep a log. If he continues entering illegally and you can prove it, we might have grounds for a harassment claim. But right now, we don't have enough. I installed a camera that afternoon, just one, positioned to capture the apartment entrance and part of the living room. It was a small wireless model that saved footage to the cloud, motion activated, easy to hide. I mounted it on a bookshelf behind a plant, angled so it would catch anyone coming through the door. Then I waited. 3 days passed without incident. I started to think maybe the camera's idea had been paranoia, that Keene was right about it, potentially escalating things. But on the 4th day, while I was at work, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera. I pulled up the app, heart already racing, and watched live as Vincent Caruso walked into my apartment. He was alone, wearing a suit like he was coming from a business meeting, and he moved through my space with the casual entitlement of someone who believed he owned not just the building, but everything inside it. He went to my desk first, opened drawers, pulled out papers, photographed them with his phone. Then he moved to my bedroom. I felt violated watching this, physically sick with a combination of rage and helplessness. I was 40 minutes away at my office, unable to do anything except watch as my landlord systematically searched through my private belongings. He spent nearly 20 minutes in my apartment, going through closets, checking under furniture, photographing various items and documents. At one point, he picked up a prescription bottle from my bathroom and photographed the label. That image, this man in my most personal space, photographing my medication, triggered something primal in me. I saved the footage, sent copies to my email and Julia Keene's office, and called the police again. This time I had evidence. This time they had to take it seriously. The officer who answered my call was patient as I explained what I'd captured on video. He said they'd send someone to my workplace to take a statement and review the footage. I told him I was leaving immediately to go home, needed to secure my apartment. The officer advised against confronting the landlord directly. I wasn't planning to confront him. I was planning to document every goddamn second of this. The police sent a detective, Sergeant Thomas Krakowski, to meet me at my apartment. He reviewed the footage on his laptop, his expression hardening as he watched Caruso rifle through my belongings. "This is clear illegal entry," Krakowski said. "Landlords can enter for emergencies or with proper notice, but this is neither. And photographing your personal documents? That's potentially identity theft depending on what he's doing with those photos." I asked what would happen next. Krakowski said he'd interview Caruso, collect his side of the story, file charges if warranted. He continued. I felt my hope deflating. Quote 16. Krakowski shook his head. Quote 17. That last point stuck with me after Krakowski left. If Caruso was doing this to me, systematically harassing a tenant to force them out, he was likely doing it to others. I lived in a building with 48 units. How many other tenants were being targeted? I'd been so focused on my own situation that I hadn't considered the broader pattern. I thought about the tenants who'd moved out shortly after Caruso took over. Had they left voluntarily, or had they been forced out through similar harassment? I started knocking on neighbors' doors that evening, asking if anyone else had experienced strange occurrences. Most people were polite but non-committal, clearly not wanting to get involved. But one person, a woman named Diane Foster, who'd lived in the building for 12 years, invited me inside immediately. "Thank God someone's finally talking about this," she said, closing the door behind us. I thought I was going crazy. Diane's story was horrifyingly similar to mine. She'd come home multiple times to find her apartment unlocked, belongings rearranged, personal items missing. Small things, a piece of jewelry, some cash from a drawer, things she couldn't prove had been stolen because she couldn't prove how much she'd had in the first place. She'd also received a non-renewal notice, despite being a long-term tenant with a rent-controlled lease. "He wants us all out," Diane said. "The rent-controlled tenants. We're paying a fraction of what he could get from new tenants. I've been paying $1,200 for a 2-bedroom. He could get $3,000 easily at market rate. But rent control laws protect us as long as we're in good standing, so he's making sure we're not in good standing." I asked if she'd reported the break-ins. She had, multiple times, to both building management and police. Nothing came of it. No evidence, no witnesses, no proof. Just like my situation before I'd installed the camera. She showed me a binder she'd been keeping, filled with documentation of every incident, dates, times, what was missing or disturbed, photos she'd taken of her apartment after each violation. It was meticulous, obsessive even, the work of someone desperate to prove they weren't crazy. Quote 22. Diane said, her voice breaking. Quote 23. She wiped her eyes angrily. Quote 24. I showed Diane the footage I'd captured of Caruso in my apartment. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "That's what he's been doing to me," she whispered. "That's exactly what I knew was happening but couldn't prove." I asked if she had cameras. She didn't. Hadn't thought to install them, had just absorbed the gaslighting and started questioning her own perception. I told her to install cameras immediately, document everything going forward. Then I asked the question that had been forming since Krakowski mentioned patterns. "How many other tenants do you think are experiencing this?" Diane's answer was chilling. Quote 28. That revelation changed everything. This wasn't just harassment of one tenant. This was a systematic campaign to illegally evict rent-controlled tenants. Caruso was committing crimes against potentially a dozen people, violating housing laws designed to protect long-term residents, all to maximize his profit. I contacted Julia Keene again, explained what I'd learned. Her response was immediate. Quote, 29. She arranged a meeting at her office for the following evening, said to bring anyone who'd experienced similar treatment. I spent the next day reaching out to every rent-controlled tenant I could identify. 7 people showed up at Keene's office, each with stories of break-ins, missing items, mysterious apartment disturbances, and non-renewal notices. The pattern was undeniable. Keene recorded each person's account, took notes, asked detailed questions about timing and specific incidents. When everyone had spoken, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is illegal eviction through harassment. It's a felony in this state, and with this many victims, it's a pattern that prosecutors can't ignore. But we need more evidence. The video Thomas captured is excellent, but we need to show this is systematic, not an isolated incident. I recommend several of you install cameras and see if we can catch him in other units." I'd already shared camera information with Diane and 2 others who'd attended the meeting. Everyone agreed to install cameras. We were going to document every illegal entry, every invasion of privacy, every criminal act. Caruso had made a crucial mistake. He'd bragged to me once, early in his ownership, about installing state-of-the-art security cameras throughout the building to deter crime. Those cameras existed. I'd seen them in hallways, stairwells, the lobby. But Caruso apparently hadn't considered that those same cameras might document his crimes. I asked Keene about the building's security footage. Could we access it to show Caruso entering units when he shouldn't be? She said building security footage was technically the property owner's, but we might be able to subpoena it through legal proceedings or request it through police investigation. Sergeant Krakowski had already interviewed Caruso, who'd claimed he'd entered my apartment because he'd smelled gas and feared a leak. Obvious lie. There was no gas in my apartment. The building was all electric, and nothing in the footage suggested he was checking for anything hazardous. He'd gone straight to my desk and bedroom, photographed personal documents, acted like someone conducting surveillance, not checking for emergencies. Krakowski wasn't buying the gas leak story either, had noted it in his report. But without additional evidence of pattern, prosecutors were hesitant to file charges. One incident could potentially be explained away. Multiple incidents across multiple tenants couldn't. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 more tenants captured footage of Caruso or his nephew Anthony entering their apartments without notice. Each video showed the same pattern: walking in with keys, searching through personal belongings, photographing documents, sometimes taking small items. One tenant, an elderly man named Walter Gregory, caught them taking $200 in cash he kept in a desk drawer for emergencies. Another tenant, a young woman named Lisa Huang, caught them going through her bedroom dresser, handling her personal clothing in a way that made my skin crawl watching the footage. Each video was forwarded to Sergeant Krakowski and Julia Keene. Each added to the mounting evidence of systematic harassment. Keene filed a motion for emergency injunction, seeking to prevent Caruso from entering any tenant's unit without proper notice and court oversight. The judge granted a temporary order, pending a full hearing. When Caruso was served with the injunction, his response was exactly what I'd expected: escalation. But before the escalation came a revelation that made everything worse. One of the tenants who'd installed a camera, a software engineer named David Kumar, discovered something chilling when he reviewed his footage. Caruso hadn't just entered David's apartment once. He'd been entering regularly for months, always when David was at work, always for about 15 to 20 minutes. David went back through his archived footage and found 19 separate illegal entries over a 4-month period. Each time, Caruso followed the same routine: check the living room, bedroom, and bathroom, photograph documents, sometimes pocket small items or cash. The systematic nature of it was disturbing. This wasn't opportunistic harassment. This was routine violation, scheduled intrusion, the kind of behavior that suggested Caruso felt completely entitled to access tenants' private spaces whenever he wanted. When David showed this footage to the group, the room went silent. We'd all thought we were dealing with occasional illegal entries. This suggested something far more pervasive. 3 days after being served, Caruso filed eviction proceedings against me, Diane, and 3 other tenants who'd appeared in the injunction motion. The eviction notices claimed various lease violations, noise complaints, unauthorized guests, property damage, violation of occupancy rules. All of it was fabricated. I'd never received a noise complaint in 3 years. I had no unauthorized guests. My apartment was in perfect condition. But Caruso had apparently decided that if he couldn't force us out quietly, he'd do it loudly. The eviction filings were public record, would appear in tenant screening reports, could make it difficult to rent elsewhere even if we successfully fought them. It was retaliation, pure and simple, and it was illegal. But knowing something was illegal and stopping it were different things. We now had multiple legal fronts to fight, defending against evictions, pursuing harassment claims, seeking damages for the illegal entries. All of it required money and time most of us didn't have. Keene said she'd take our case on contingency, no payment unless we won, but we'd still need to cover court costs and other expenses. That's when someone suggested we contact the media. If Caruso was going to make this public through eviction proceedings, maybe we should tell our side publicly too. One tenant knew a reporter at the local news station who covered housing issues. We reached out, explained the situation, offered to provide footage and documentation. The reporter, Monica Delgado, was interested immediately. She said, "We gave her everything. Copies of the security footage, written statements from each tenant, documentation of non-renewal notices and eviction filings, records of our complaints to building management and police." Delgado spent a week verifying the facts, interviewed Sergeant Krakowski and Julia Keene on camera, tried to get comment from Caruso. He refused to speak to her, had his lawyer send a cease and desist letter threatening to sue the station if they aired the story. The station aired it anyway. The news segment was devastating for Caruso. It opened with footage from my camera showing him walking into my apartment, going through my desk, photographing documents. The anchor's voiceover explained rent control laws, the housing crisis in our city, how landlords were increasingly using harassment to force out protected tenants. Delgado interviewed Diane on camera, her voice shaking as she described coming home repeatedly to find her space violated. The segment showed the building's exterior, identified Caruso by name, called out Caruso Properties LLC for systematic tenant harassment. Within hours of the segment airing, our story was everywhere. Local news websites, social media, tenant rights advocacy groups. The building's phone line was flooded with calls from reporters requesting comment, from city council members expressing outrage, from the housing authority launching an investigation. Caruso couldn't hide anymore. His illegal activities were now documented, publicized, impossible to dismiss as paranoid tenants or civil disputes. The media coverage triggered something unexpected. Other victims from Caruso's previous properties started coming forward. A woman named Rebecca Thornton contacted Monica Delgado, said she'd rented from Caruso 3 years ago at a different building, experienced the same pattern of illegal entries and harassment, eventually moved out because she couldn't prove what was happening and couldn't afford to fight legally. She'd kept a journal, had documented everything, but without video evidence, no one had taken her seriously. Now, seeing our story, she realized she'd been part of the same systematic scheme. Another former tenant, a man named Jerome Washington, described losing $3,000 in valuables from his apartment over 6 months, small items taken gradually, a watch here, some electronics there, jewelry, cash. He'd reported it to police as burglary, but with no signs of forced entry, they'd suggested he might be mistaken about what he owned. The pattern was becoming clear. Caruso had been doing this for years, across multiple properties, refining his technique, always targeting rent-controlled tenants or people he wanted to force out. The morning after the news segment aired, I woke to find a notice posted on every apartment door in the building. It was from Caruso, claiming the news story was defamatory, that we'd violated our leases by speaking to media, that eviction proceedings would be pursued against anyone who participated in the slanderous attacks against him. The notice was unhinged, threatening, clearly written in panic. Julia Keene photographed it immediately, sent it to the prosecutor handling our case. "This is witness intimidation," she said. "He's threatening tenants for cooperating with law enforcement and exercising their free speech rights. This is a crime." She filed an emergency motion with the judge who'd granted our injunction, requesting contempt charges for violating the order barring harassment. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I had the sense we were approaching some kind of breaking point, that Caruso's escalation was unsustainable, that the pressure was building toward an explosion. The explosion came sooner than expected. 2 days before the court hearing, I came home to find police cars and news vans surrounding the building. Something had happened. Something big. I approached the building entrance where a crowd had gathered, asked a neighbor what was going on. "They arrested Caruso," she said, "and Anthony, both of them, like an hour ago." I pushed through the crowd, found Sergeant Krakowski near the entrance. He saw me and walked over, his expression grim. "We executed a search warrant this morning," he explained. "Based on the footage you all provided and some additional evidence we developed, we found a lot." He couldn't give me details yet. The investigation was ongoing, but he could tell me that both Vincent and Anthony Caruso had been arrested on multiple felony charges: illegal entry, theft, identity theft, harassment, intimidation of witnesses, violations of the restraining order, Krakowski added. The Krakowski mentioned became clearer over the following days. Apparently, when police executed the search warrant on Caruso's office, they'd found detailed files on each rent-controlled tenant, notes about our schedules, copies of our personal documents that he'd photographed during illegal entries, communications between Vincent and Anthony discussing strategies for forcing tenants out. They'd found evidence of bribes paid to a city inspector to cite violations that didn't exist. They'd found documents showing Caruso had been systematically targeting not just our building but 3 others he owned, using the same harassment tactics to clear out rent-controlled tenants and replace them with market-rate renters. The investigation expanded to include dozens of additional victims across multiple properties. What started as my personal harassment had uncovered a wide-ranging criminal enterprise built on exploiting housing laws and vulnerable tenants. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Assistant District Attorney Frederick Paulson, contacted all of us individually for formal statements. He was thorough, asked detailed questions, seemed genuinely outraged by what had been done to us, Paulson said during my interview. Quote 44. That last point was particularly satisfying. Vincent Caruso had bragged about those cameras, had installed them as a selling point for the building. Quote 45. He'd never imagined they'd protect residents from him. The building's security footage became crucial evidence, showing the Carusos entering multiple units repeatedly over months, always when tenants were away, always without the required notice. The criminal trial took 8 months to begin. In that time, Julia Keene filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of all affected tenants, seeking damages for harassment, illegal eviction attempts, emotional distress, and punitive damages to deter similar conduct. The civil case settled before trial. Caruso's insurance company paid out $1.2 million divided among 14 tenants, rather than risk a jury trial with the overwhelming evidence against their client. My share was $85,000 after legal fees, enough to relocate to a better apartment and have a cushion for the first time in years. But the money wasn't the point. The point was justice, accountability, ensuring Caruso couldn't do this to anyone else. The criminal trial would determine that. Paulson charged Vincent Caruso with 43 felony counts across multiple victims. Anthony Caruso faced 31 charges. The evidence was overwhelming: video footage of illegal entries, stolen items recovered from their possession, documented communications discussing their harassment strategy, testimony from multiple victims, expert witnesses on housing law and tenant rights. The trial itself was a spectacle. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks to present, methodically building the evidence piece by piece. Paulson started with my testimony, walking the jury through the discovery of the unlocked door, the installation of the camera, the footage that captured Caruso in my apartment. The video played on screens throughout the courtroom, and I watched the jurors' faces as they saw Caruso rifle through my desk, photograph my prescription bottles, pocket a $20 bill I'd left on my dresser. One juror, a middle-aged woman in the front row, shook her head in disgust. Another, a young man who looked barely old enough to serve, leaned forward with his jaw clenched. The footage was damning in a way words could never be. This wasn't allegation or hearsay. This was high-definition documentation of crimes in progress. The defense strategy was predictable. Claim everything was legitimate landlord business. Argue that they'd had reasonable cause to enter units. Suggest tenants were exaggerating or lying for financial gain. But the video footage demolished that defense. You couldn't watch Vincent Caruso photograph my prescription bottles and argue he was checking for a gas leak. You couldn't watch him take $200 from Walter Gregory's desk and claim it was legitimate property inspection. The jury saw through it immediately. Deliberation lasted less than a day. Guilty on all counts for Vincent Caruso. Guilty on all but 3 counts for Anthony, who managed to show he hadn't been present for every incident. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the interim, both Carusos remained free on bail, though the judge revoked Vincent's property management license and appointed a court-supervised receiver to manage his buildings until the properties could be sold. During cross-examination, Caruso's defense attorney, a slick lawyer named Gregory Phillips, tried to paint me as vindictive and opportunistic. "Isn't it true, Mr. Fletcher, that you installed cameras specifically hoping to catch my client doing something wrong so you could sue him?" Phillips asked, his tone suggesting this was some kind of gotcha question. I looked at him calmly. "I installed cameras because someone was illegally entering my apartment, violating my privacy, and stealing from me. The fact that your client was the person doing those things isn't my fault. It's his." Phillips tried another angle. "Isn't it convenient that you have video evidence but no one else had thought to install cameras before you?" I answered, "It's not convenient. It's just that I was willing to trust my own perceptions instead of accepting gaslighting from someone in a position of power. Other tenants installed cameras after I showed them it was possible. They all caught the same thing: your client committing crimes." Phillips had no response to that. The truth was too clear, too documented, too undeniable. I attended the sentencing hearing with Diane, Walter, Lisa, and 4 other victims. We wanted to be there, wanted to see justice delivered in person. The judge, Carmen Delgado, no relation to the reporter who'd broken the story, allowed victim impact statements. Diane spoke first, describing how the harassment had made her terrified in her own home, how she'd stopped sleeping well, developed anxiety, started questioning her own memory and sanity. Walter talked about being a veteran on a fixed income, how the stolen money had meant going without medication for a week. Lisa spoke about the violation of having someone go through her intimate belongings, how she'd felt exposed and unsafe ever since. When it was my turn, I focused on the systematic nature of what had been done to us. Quote 50. I said. Quote 51. Judge Delgado listened to all the statements, reviewed the evidence again, then delivered her sentence. Quote 52. Anthony Caruso received 4 years in prison, 2 years probation, and a 5-year ban on property management licenses. Both were ordered to pay restitution to victims, though the civil settlement had already addressed most financial damages. As the Carusos were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Vincent turned and looked at me directly. There was no remorse in his expression, just cold calculation even now, probably already thinking about appeals and early release and how to rebuild when he got out. But there was also recognition. Acknowledgement that I'd been the one who'd installed the camera, who'd caught him in the act, and who'd organized the other tenants and made this all unravel. His expression said, "This is your fault," and my expression back said, "Yes, it is. I'd done this to him by refusing to accept abuse, by documenting his crimes, by fighting back. That was my fault, and I'd never been more proud of anything in my life." Judge Delgado dismissed the court, and we all walked out into autumn sunlight, fundamentally changed by what we'd endured, but also validated, vindicated, proven right in our insistence that what we'd experienced was real and wrong and criminal. The building was sold 6 months later as part of the criminal restitution process. The new owners, a nonprofit housing organization, committed to maintaining rent control units and respecting tenant rights. Diane still lives there, in her $1,200 2-bedroom that would cost $3,000 on the open market. Walter still lives there too, his medication stolen by Caruso, finally replaced and paid for by restitution funds. I moved out, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to, used my settlement money to rent a better apartment in a building with an honest landlord. But I stayed in touch with the others, bound by shared trauma and shared victory. We'd been targeted because we were vulnerable, because Caruso thought we couldn't fight back, thought we'd absorb the abuse silently. He was wrong. We fought back, we won, and in the process, we exposed a systematic pattern of abuse affecting dozens of tenants across multiple properties. The cameras Caruso installed to create an illusion of safety became the instruments of his downfall, documenting his crimes in high-definition detail that no amount of lying could refute. The case had ripple effects beyond our immediate situation. The City Council passed new legislation strengthening tenant protections, requiring landlords to provide detailed written notice before any non-emergency entry, mandating security camera access for tenants in buildings where surveillance systems existed, and increasing criminal penalties for landlord harassment. The law was informally called Caruso's Law in the tenant advocacy community, a permanent reminder of what happens when landlords abuse their power. Julia Keene used our case as the foundation for a tenant rights organization that provided free legal assistance to renters experiencing harassment or illegal eviction attempts. She'd take our settlement as her fee and decided the work was too important to abandon. Monica Delgado won a journalism award for her investigative reporting on landlord abuse, used the platform to continue exposing housing injustice across the city. Sergeant Krakowski became known as the detective who took tenant complaints seriously, developed training protocols for other officers on how to investigate landlord harassment cases. Each person who'd been involved in exposing Caruso found purpose in preventing similar abuse. Sometimes justice comes from the unexpected places, from tenants who refuse to be intimidated, from cameras that capture the truth, from systematic harassment that finally triggers systematic accountability. Vincent Caruso wanted us gone, wanted to exploit his power over vulnerable people for profit. Instead, he gave us evidence, community, and ultimately, justice that sent him to prison and freed us from his control. That unlocked door I'd found that first evening wasn't a mistake or forgetfulness. It was a crime, one of many, and it led directly to the unraveling of everything he'd built on exploitation and abuse. 3 years after the trial, I still think about that first unlocked door, about how close I came to dismissing my own instincts, accepting Caruso's gaslighting, convincing myself I'd imagined the whole thing. If I'd been less certain, less stubborn, less willing to trust my own perceptions over authorities' dismissal, Caruso would still be terrorizing tenants, still be stealing and harassing with impunity. The system hadn't protected us. We'd protected ourselves by documenting, organizing, refusing to accept abuse as normal. That's the lesson I carried forward. Power doesn't concede without pressure. Justice doesn't arrive automatically, and sometimes the only protection available is the protection you create for yourself. The camera I'd hidden behind a plant had cost $60. That $60 investment had brought down a criminal enterprise, liberated dozens of victims, changed city housing laws, and sent 2 predators to prison. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance become the pivots on which everything turns. I'd bought a camera. I'd organized my neighbors. I'd refused to be silent, and that had been enough to shatter a system built on intimidation and isolation. Caruso had forgotten that the cameras he'd bragged about installing worked both ways. They didn't just catch criminals breaking in, they caught criminals breaking law from the inside, documented abuse of power in perfect detail, became the evidence that destroyed him. His arrogance had been his downfall, his assumption that power meant immunity, his belief that vulnerable people would stay powerless. He'd been wrong about all of it, and that wrongness had cost him everything: his freedom, his properties, his reputation, his future. Meanwhile, the tenants he'd tried to destroy had survived, thrived, built new lives on foundations stronger than before, bound together by shared trauma, transformed into shared triumph. That was the real victory, not just stopping one predator, but proving that resistance was possible, that documentation mattered, that collective action worked, that justice, though delayed and difficult, could ultimately prevail when people refused to accept abuse as inevitable. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.